Frost crawled across the ancient granite battlements like skeletal fingers. Thorn Blackthorn stood motionless atop the highest tower of Ironheart Fortress, his weathered face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountain beneath his feet. Wind howled around him, tugging at his thick cloak of midnight fur, yet he remained unmoved. His golden eyes, burning with an inner fire that had not dimmed in 6 decades, surveyed the vast territory spreading before him. Something was wrong with his land. The forests that had once pulsed with vibrant energy now stood muted, their colors faded like an old tapestry left too long in harsh sunlight. The rivers that had once thundered with the lifeblood of the mountain now trickled, weak and faltering. Even the air itself tasted thinner, the magic that had once saturated every breath now barely perceptible. Thorn inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of his domain. Pine and stone, wolf and prey, the metallic tang of the approaching winter. These scents had been his constant companions for over 100 years, as familiar as his own heartbeat. But beneath them lurked something new, something wrong, the faint odor of decay. His massive hands, scarred from countless battles, gripped the stone parapet. Tiny fissures spread beneath his fingers as the rock protested against his strength. He was Thorn Blackthorn, alpha of the Ironheart Pack, ruler of the Northern Territories, and his power was unquestioned. But even he could not command the mountain to heal itself. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as if it had happened yesterday rather than 40 years ago. The previous alpha, Raven Ironheart, on his knees before Thorn, blood pooling beneath him, his once proud body broken. The look in his eyes not of hatred or fear, but of relief. "The mountain chose you," Raven had whispered, as his lifeblood leaked between Thorn's fingers. "Bear its burden well." Thorn had not wanted the crown. He had challenged Raven out of necessity, not ambition. The pack had been weak, their territory shrinking, their cubs starving. Thorn had been young then, barely 30, full of fire and certainty. He had believed he could restore the Ironheart Pack to its former glory through sheer force of will. For a time, he had succeeded. Under his rule, the pack had flourished. Their borders had expanded. Their enemies had learned to fear the very whisper of his name. But now, after decades of prosperity, the sickness had returned. Not to the pack this time, but to the very land itself. The sound of footsteps pulled Thorn from his thoughts. He did not turn. Only one person would dare approach him during his morning vigil. Morgan Wiseheart climbed the final step to the tower's platform, his breath coming in labored puffs that crystallized in the frigid air. Age had bent his once straight spine, turning him into a question mark of a man. His eyes, however, remained sharp, missing nothing. "The council awaits your decision on the hunt, my king," Morgan said, his voice like dry leaves rustling across stone. Thorn continued to stare out across his domain. The hunt of the blood moon, an ancient tradition as old as the pack itself. Once every decade, the weak were culled. Those deemed unworthy were marked and released into the Blackwood Forest to be hunted. It was cruel, yes, but necessary. The pack's strength could not be diluted by weakness, not in this harsh land where only the strong survived. "The hunt proceeds as planned," Thorn finally rumbled, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Morgan shifted, his ancient bones creaking like old timber. "There are those who question the necessity in these softer times." Thorn finally turned, fixing Morgan with a stare that had made braver men than him quail. "The hunt is not about necessity, it is about purity. The blood of the Ironheart must remain strong." Something flickered across Morgan's weathered face, too quick to interpret. "And what of the omens? The weakening of the mountain's heart? The dreams that plague your sleep?" Thorn's jaw clenched. The dreams. For nearly 100 years they had come to him, always the same, a wolf of midnight black, larger than any he had ever seen, with eyes that burned like twin moons, a wolf that bowed to no one, not even him, a wolf that both terrified and captivated him. "The dreams are nothing," Thorn growled, "the ramblings of an old man's mind." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "You have never been one for self-deception, my king. The mountain's power wanes. The connection that has sustained your line for 1,000 years grows weaker with each passing season. The time of reckoning approaches." Thorn turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in the old man's words. His own power, once limitless, had begun to ebb, like the tide pulling away from the shore. He could feel it in his bones, in the silver threading through his once pure black hair, in the ache that never quite left his joints. "Prepare the markers," Thorn ordered. "The hunt begins at moonrise." Morgan bowed, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and disappointment. "As you command." When the old advisor had gone, Thorn closed his eyes and reached deep within himself to the place where his wolf resided. Not his physical form, but his spirit animal, the embodiment of his power and connection to the primal forces of nature. Once, it had been a constant presence, a bonfire of strength and certainty. Now it flickered, a candle in a drafty room. Something had to change. The pack needed new blood, new strength. Perhaps the hunt would reveal a solution. It had to. For without it, the Ironheart pack and Thorn himself faced a slow, inexorable decline into obscurity. And that, more than anything, was a fate Thorn refused to accept. The floor of the Blackwood forest was a cold, unforgiving bed of mud and decaying leaves. Lyra Moonshadow lay still, her thin body pressed against the gnarled root of an ancient oak, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Above, the moon hung like a sliver of polished bone, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the wind. She had been running for hours, her bare feet bloodied and numb, her lungs burning with each ragged breath. The hunt sigil carved into her cheek throbbed, a constant reminder of her status. Omega, the lowest of the low, wolfless, unworthy. Lyra had known this day would come ever since her 10th birthday, when the change had failed to manifest. Year after year she had waited for her wolf to awaken, for the power that was her birthright to flow through her veins. It never came. While other children shifted and ran under the moon, she remained trapped in her weak human form, a disappointment to her lineage. Her father had been a great warrior, a beta who died defending the pack's borders against the Ravagers' first incursion. Her mother had not survived his loss, fading away like mist under the summer sun. Lyra had been left alone, a wolfless orphan in a society that valued strength above all else. For 10 years she had endured. Scraps from the pack's table, sleeping in the cold corner of the Omega dens, taunts and blows from those who saw her weakness as an affront to the pack's honor. She had learned to make herself small, to swallow her pride, to survive. But now, at 20, her time had run out. The hunt had claimed her, as she had always known it would. The only surprise was that she had lasted this long. A sound reached her ears, so faint that only desperation's sharpened senses could have caught it. The snap of a twig 100 yards to the east. Lyra froze, not even daring to blink. They were coming. She had to move, but her limbs felt leaden, her body betraying her when she needed it most. With painful slowness, she eased herself up from her hiding place, wincing as fallen leaves crackled beneath her weight. A new scent drifted on the wind, faint but distinctive. Water. Not the stagnant puddles that dotted the forest floor, but fresh flowing water. A stream, perhaps, or a small river. Water meant a chance to mask her scent, to throw off the hunters for a few precious hours. Gathering her remaining strength, Lyra pushed herself forward, moving as swiftly as her exhausted body would allow. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together like old men huddled against the cold. The underbrush clawed at her legs, leaving thin red scratches that stung in the night air. The sound of water grew louder, a gentle burbling that promised temporary salvation. But as Lyra crested a small rise, her heart sank. Before her stretched not a river, but a narrow stream, barely knee-deep. Worse, the banks were open, exposed. Crossing would mean leaving the shelter of the trees, making herself visible to any eyes that might be watching. A howl shattered the night, closer than she had expected. Not the deep, authoritative howl of a full shifter, but the higher, more desperate cry of a partial transformation. The hunters were closing in, tracking her by scent. Lyra had no choice. She scrambled down the embankment, wincing as loose stones cut into her already wounded feet. The water was a shock of icy cold that stole her breath and sent pain shooting up her legs. Gritting her teeth, she waded into the middle of the stream and began to move downstream, each step a battle against the current and her own faltering strength. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when the ground beneath her feet changed. No longer smooth stones, but something harder, more regular. Flagstones. Ancient and worn, but unmistakably worked by intelligent hands. Curiosity momentarily overcame fear. Lyra looked down, squinting in the dim moonlight. The stream bed was paved, the stones arranged in a pattern that seemed vaguely familiar, though she could not place why. The pattern led upstream, toward a dark shadow in the hillside that might have been a cave entrance. Another howl, this one different, deeper, more resonant, the sound of a beta in full shift. They had brought out the elite hunters. The cave beckoned, a black mouth in the silver-washed landscape. It might be a trap, a dead end where the hunters could corner her at their leisure, but it might also contain hidden depths, passages too narrow for the larger shifters to follow. With death loping toward her through the darkness, Lyra chose the unknown over the certain. She followed the ancient path, her feet finding unexpected purchase on the smooth stones. The stream led directly into the cave mouth, disappearing into the blackness beyond. The entrance was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely tall enough for Lyra to enter without stooping. The air within was surprisingly warm, heavy with the scent of minerals, and something else, something old and powerful that she could not identify. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Lyra gasped. The walls of the cave were covered in symbols, hundreds of them, carved deep into the living rock. They glowed faintly, a soft blue luminescence that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Spirals, crescents, stylized wolves, and more complex designs that defied easy interpretation. Drawn as if by an unseen hand, Lyra approached one section of the wall where the symbols were arranged in a circular pattern around a central image of a wolf with a crescent moon cradled between its jaws. She had seen this symbol before, in the oldest texts in the Pax library, texts that Omegas were forbidden to read. Without thinking, she raised her hand to touch the central carving. Her finger had barely brushed the stone when pain lanced through her palm. She jerked back, startled, to find a thin cut across her hand, blood welling from the wound. The stone had cut her, impossibly sharp despite its age. A drop of blood fell from her palm, striking the symbol of the wolf. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the glow intensified, the soft blue light brightening to an almost painful brilliance. The blood sank into the stone as if absorbed by a thirsty mouth, and the carving began to change. The wolf's eyes, once empty depressions, filled with a silvery light that fixed on Lyra with an awareness that sent chills racing down her spine. A voice spoke in her mind, ancient and powerful, neither male nor female, but something beyond such simple distinctions. "At last," it said, the words resonating in her bones rather than her ears. "The blood returns." Before Lyra could react, the light from the symbols flowed from the wall like liquid, swirling around her in a vortex of blue and silver. It sank into her skin, a cold fire that penetrated muscle and bone, reaching for something buried deep within her core. Pain, unlike anything she had ever experienced, tore through Lyra's body. She fell to her knees, a scream locked in her throat as every cell seemed to ignite. This was not the change, the controlled transformation that she had envied in others. This was something older, wilder, a power that had been sleeping since before the first stone of Ironheart Fortress had been laid. Inside her, something answered the call. The wolf that should have awakened a decade ago stirred, stretching like a predator too long confined. But it was not the modest creature she had always imagined. It was vast, a shadow that filled the cavern of her soul, its eyes twin moons that gazed out at a world it found both strange and familiar. The pain crested, then subsided, leaving Lyra gasping on the cave floor. She felt different, stronger. The weariness that had plagued her limbs was gone, replaced by a humming vitality that made her skin tingle. A sound at the cave entrance shattered the moment. Heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on stone. The hunters had found her. Darius Irongrip stood silhouetted against the night sky, his massive frame blocking most of the entrance. He was in mid-shift, his face elongated into a partial muzzle, his hands tipped with razor-sharp claws. Behind him, 4 more hunters waited, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Little Lyra," Darius growled, his voice distorted by his partial transformation. "The runt of the litter. Did you think you could escape the hunt?" Lyra rose to her feet, a strange calm settling over her, despite the dire situation. The new presence within her observed the intruders with cool detachment, assessing rather than fearing. "This place is sacred," Lyra said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You should not be here." Darius laughed, a harsh barking sound echoed by his companions. "Sacred? It is a hole in the ground, nothing more. Fitting that you would seek refuge in the dirt, like the worm you are." He took a step forward, claws flexing. "Your father was the same. All talk of honor and ancient ways. Look where it got him. Forgotten. His blood spilled for nothing." At the mention of her father, something snapped within Lyra. The wolf that had been awakened surged forward, no longer content to observe. Rage, pure and primal, flooded her system, setting her blood alight. "My father was worth 10 of you," Lyra snarled, her voice deeper than before, resonating with a power that made the hunters pause. Darius recovered quickly, his lips pulling back to reveal gleaming fangs. "Your father was a fool who died a dog's death. And now, so will his daughter." He lunged, confident in his superior strength and the certainty of his victory. Lyra had never shifted, never fought, never been anything but the Omega they could torment at will. But the Lyra who stood before him now was not the same creature who had fled into the forest. The change, when it came, was not the smooth transformation of a practiced shifter. It was agony and ecstasy, destruction and rebirth. Her bones cracked and reformed, lengthening, strengthening. Her skin split and healed in the same instant, midnight fur erupting to cover her transforming body. Her senses exploded, the world suddenly a symphony of scent and sound. She could smell the fear beginning to replace the hunter's confidence, could hear the rapid acceleration of their heartbeats. Where once stood a slender human woman, now towered a wolf of impossible proportions. Lyra's transformed body was massive, her shoulders reaching higher than a man's head, her paws wide enough to cover a dinner plate. Her fur was black as a moonless night, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Only her eyes held color, burning with the same silvery luminescence as the cave symbols. For a heartbeat, everyone stood frozen in shock. Then Darius, driven by fear or pride or simple bloodlust, attacked. His claws swept toward Lyra's throat, a killing strike that would have decapitated her human form. But the wolf moved with a speed that belied its size, sidestepping the attack with fluid grace. Jaws larger than a bear trap closed around Darius's extended arm, crushing bone and severing arteries in a single bite. Darius's scream was cut short as Lyra's massive paw struck his chest, driving him to the ground with enough force to crack ribs. The sound of his spine snapping was audible even over his companions' shouts of alarm. The remaining hunters tried to flee, but the cavern entrance was narrow, and panic made them clumsy. They collided with each other, struggling to escape the death that now stalked them with cold precision. Lyra moved through them like a shadow, given form and fang. There was no thought, no hesitation, only the hunt. One by one, they fell, their shifts incomplete, their strength insignificant against the primal force that had been unleashed. In less than a minute, it was over. 5 of the pack's elite hunters lay dead, their bodies torn and broken. Blood pooled on the ancient stones, seeping into the carvings, which pulsed with renewed brightness. The cave's atmosphere changed, the air growing heavier, charged with an energy that made Lyra's fur stand on end. The symbols began to move, flowing across the walls like living things, converging on the central wolf and moon motif. The cave mouth, which had been clear just moments before, was now obscured by a thick mist that swirled and eddied as if stirred by unseen currents. Through this supernatural fog strode a figure of such presence that even in her transformed state, Lyra felt a primal urge to submit. Thorn Blackthorn entered the sacred cave like a force of nature, his massive frame somehow making the space seem smaller. He was not shifted, yet power radiated from him in almost visible waves. His golden eyes took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, missing nothing. The dead hunters, the glowing symbols, the massive black wolf that stood amid the carnage, blood still dripping from its jaws. Behind him came others, Garrett Stormborn, his personal guard and second in command, and 3 members of the High Council, their faces masks of shock and outrage.
"Alpha!"
One of the counselors gasped, his voice thin with horror. "The Omega has gone mad. She has murdered 5 of our brothers." Thorn did not acknowledge the counselor's words. His attention was fixed entirely on Lyra, his golden eyes meeting her silver ones in a clash of wills that seemed to make the very air between them shimmer. Then something extraordinary happened. A spectral form took shape around Thorn, translucent yet unmistakable. His spirit wolf, a creature of legend that only the most powerful alphas could manifest. It was enormous, a titan of silver and shadow with eyes of burning gold that mirrored Thorn's own. The spectral wolf stared at Lyra, at the blood on her muzzle and the defiance in her stance. For a moment, the 2 primal forces regarded each other, ancient powers assessing, measuring. Then, slowly and with deliberate ceremony, the spirit wolf lowered its massive head in a gesture of profound respect. Gasps echoed around the cave. The spirit wolf of an alpha bowed to no one, not in 1,000 years of recorded pack history. It was unthinkable, impossible. More impossible still was what happened next. The spectral wolf raised its head and spoke, not with sound, but directly into Lyra's mind, a voice like thunder rolling over distant mountains. "The mountain has chosen," it rumbled, words that only Lyra could hear. "The key returns." Thorn's physical body showed the only sign of this extraordinary communion, a slight widening of his eyes, a momentary parting of his lips in surprise. Then his face settled back into its habitual mask of stern authority. "The Omega dies for this outrage," another counselor declared, stepping forward with his hand on the hilt of a ceremonial silver dagger. "The law is clear. She has spilled pack blood. Her life is forfeit." Thorn turned his head with the slow deliberation of a glacier changing course. His gaze fell upon the counselor like a physical weight, causing the man to step back involuntarily. "She acted in self-defense," Thorn said, his deep voice filling the cave. "These 5 violated the terms of the hunt. They pursued her to sacred ground they knew was forbidden. The law cuts both ways." "But she is an Omega," the counselor protested, though with less conviction. "Wolfless, a disgrace to the pack." Thorn's laugh was a harsh bark, utterly devoid of humor. "Look at her and tell me again she is wolfless." The counselors fell silent, unable to refute the evidence before them. The black wolf that had been Lyra Moonshadow was perhaps the most magnificent specimen any of them had ever seen, a creature of primal power that made their own wolves seem like pale imitations. "This changes nothing," the first counselor finally said. "She has killed pack members. There must be justice." "There will be," Thorn agreed, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "But it will be justice of my choosing. The Omega comes with me to Ironheart Fortress. I will determine her fate." The counselors exchanged glances, clearly unhappy with this pronouncement, but unwilling to challenge their alpha directly. Thorn's word was law, and had been for 4 decades. Even in this unprecedented situation, none dared to openly defy him. Thorn approached Lyra, moving with the casual confidence of one apex predator approaching another. He showed no fear, though her jaws could have closed around his throat in an instant. "Shift back," he commanded, a subtle thread of alpha compulsion running through the words. "Your wolf has proven its point." The great black wolf regarded him for a long moment, silver eyes unblinking. Then, with obvious reluctance, it began to recede. Lyra's transformation reversed, bones reshaping, fur withdrawing, until she knelt naked on the blood-soaked stones. Her human form restored, but forever changed by what had transpired. Thorn removed his cloak, a heavy garment of black fur lined with dark leather, and draped it around her shoulders. His scent enveloped her, pine and stone, and the sharp electric tang of power, marking her as under his protection, as surely as if he had announced it to the world. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice neutral, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Lyra nodded, rising unsteadily to her feet. The wolf was still there, just beneath her skin, watching through her eyes, lending her a grace and strength she had never known before. She wrapped the cloak tighter around herself, overwhelmed by the rapid changes, by the deaths she had caused, by the presence of the Alpha himself. Thorn turned to Garrett. "Bring her. The council will meet at moonrise." The journey to Ironheart Fortress passed in a blur for Lyra. The forest that had been her hunting ground became just trees and undergrowth, the distance swallowed by the long strides of the Alpha's party. She was aware of eyes upon her, some curious, some hostile, as they passed through the outer settlements of the Pack territory. Word spread faster than feet could carry it. By the time they reached the fortress gates, a crowd had gathered, Pack members drawn by the scent of blood and the unprecedented situation of an Omega returning from the hunt, not as a corpse, but as the Alpha's protected charge. Ironheart Fortress rose from the mountainside like a natural formation, its ancient granite walls seeming to grow from the living rock. Towers spiraled upward, their peaks lost in the low-hanging clouds. The main gates, massive constructs of iron-reinforced wood, swung open at Thorn's approach, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity that froze as the Alpha and his unusual companion entered. Silence fell like a physical thing, heavy and oppressive. Lyra could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, the air thick with disbelief and hostility. These were the same people who had ignored or tormented her for years, who had watched her being marked for the hunt with satisfaction, certain they had seen the last of the wolfless Omega. Now she walked in the Alpha's wake, wrapped in his personal cloak, her cheeks still bearing the hunt sigil, but her eyes holding a new awareness that made the bolder ones step back. Thorn led them not to the dungeons, or even to the audience chamber, but up a winding staircase that seemed to go on forever, deep into the heart of the fortress. The higher they climbed, the fewer people they encountered, until they reached a level where the air itself seemed rarefied, heavy with age and power. The council chamber was a circular room at the top of the fortress's highest tower. Its walls were lined with tapestries depicting the history of the Pack, scenes of battle and triumph stretching back 1,000 years. In the center stood a massive round table of polished obsidian, its surface reflecting the flames from the hearth like the surface of a dark pool. Already seated at the table were the elders, men and women of advanced age, whose counsel had guided the Pack through countless generations. Their faces were maps of experience, their eyes holding the wisdom and sometimes the madness of extreme longevity. They rose as one when Thorn entered, bowing their heads in respect to their Alpha. The counselors who had been at the cave took their places, their expressions grim. Garrett stationed himself at the chamber's entrance, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword, his eyes alert for any threat to his king. Thorn guided Lyra to the chair at his right hand, the position of highest honor traditionally reserved for the Luna, the Alpha female who would rule at his side. The elder's eyes widened at this unprecedented breach of protocol, but none dared to protest openly. When all were seated, Thorn spoke, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the chamber without effort. "The hunt has revealed something unexpected. The Omega Lyra Moonshadow is not wolfless, as was believed. Her wolf has awakened, and it is unlike any we have seen in living memory." One of the elders, a woman so ancient that her skin resembled parchment stretched over bone, leaned forward. "We have heard disturbing reports. The Omega killed 5 of our hunters. This cannot go unpunished, Alpha or no." Thorn's expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The hunters violated sacred ground. They pursued beyond the boundaries set by tradition. Their deaths are on their own heads. "Even so," another elder interjected, a man whose white beard reached his waist. "The law is clear. Blood has been spilled. There must be restitution." Thorn's hand came down on the table with enough force to make the obsidian vibrate. "I am the law," he rumbled, each word distinct and final, "and I say the debt is paid." The elders subsided, though their expressions suggested the matter was far from settled. Morgan, who had been observing silently from a shadowed corner, now stepped forward, his rheumy eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "May I examine the Omega, my king?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. Thorn inclined his head in permission. Morgan approached Lyra, his movements slow and deliberate. He circled her chair, studying her from every angle with the clinical detachment of a scholar examining a rare specimen. "Hold out your hand," he instructed. Lyra hesitated, then extended her right hand, the one that had been cut by the cave symbol. The wound was already healing, but a thin red line remained, a perfect crescent that curved across her palm. Morgan sucked in a breath, his composure cracking for the first time. "The mark of the moonbound," he whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. "It has been 1,000 years." Murmurs spread around the table, the elders exchanging significant glances. Thorn remained impassive, though a muscle in his jaw tightened. "What does it mean?" Lyra asked, her voice sounding small in the cavernous chamber. Morgan looked at her as if she had suddenly spoken in an unknown language. "It means, child, that you are either the Pack's salvation or its doom." "Enough," Thorn interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Speculation serves no purpose. The Omega will remain under my protection while we determine the truth of what has occurred." An elder with a scar bisecting his face from brow to chin leaned forward. "And if she is the moonbound of legend? The wolf who devours its own pack from within? What then, Alpha?" Thorn's golden eyes narrowed. "Then I will deal with her as I have dealt with all threats to my pack, swiftly and finally." Lyra suppressed a shiver at the cold certainty in his voice. He would protect her, yes, but only so long as it served his purposes. If she became a danger, he would eliminate her, without hesitation. "There is more," Morgan said, his gaze still fixed on Lyra. "The dreams that have plagued our Alpha for nearly a century, they align with the old prophecies. The black wolf with silver eyes emerging in the time of the pack's greatest need." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The Alpha had dreamed of her? Before she even knew herself? Thorn's expression darkened. "The council is dismissed," he declared abruptly. "We will reconvene when I have had time to consider these developments." The elders rose, bowing to their Alpha with varying degrees of sincerity. As they filed out, their eyes lingered on Lyra, some calculating, some fearful, none friendly. When the last had gone, only Thorn, Garrett, and Morgan remained with Lyra. "Come," Thorn commanded, rising from his seat with fluid grace. "There is something you must see." He led them from the council chamber, deeper into the fortress, through corridors that grew increasingly narrow and ancient. The walls here were rough-hewn, lacking the polish of the public areas, as if they had been carved in haste or in a more primitive time. Finally, they reached a simple wooden door, unmarked and seemingly unremarkable. Thorn pressed his palm against it, murmuring words too low for even Lyra's enhanced hearing to catch. The wood glowed briefly. Then the door swung inward, revealing a small circular chamber lit by a single shaft of moonlight falling through an opening in the ceiling. The chamber was bare, save for a stone pedestal in the center, upon which rested an ancient tome bound in what appeared to be wolf hide. The book lay open, its pages yellowed with age, covered in script so old that Lyra could not decipher it. Thorn approached the pedestal, gesturing for Lyra to join him. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, acutely aware of the power that seemed to emanate from the ancient text. "This is the book of the first pack," Thorn explained, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. written by the original Alpha when the mountain first called our kind to its slopes. It contains prophecies, warnings, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of Ironheart rule. He indicated a specific passage. The ink faded but still legible. Lyra leaned closer, surprised to find that she could now understand the archaic text, as if the wolf within her carried the knowledge of older times. "When the mountain's heart grows cold," she read aloud, "and the blood of the Alpha runs thin, look to the forgotten one, the wolf that should not be. In blackest fur and silver gaze lies the key to the mountain's renewal. But beware, for the key that unlocks can also seal forever." Lyra looked up at Thorn, confused and overwhelmed. "You think this refers to me? That I am this key?" Thorn's golden eyes held hers, searching for something only he could name. "I have dreamed of you for nearly 100 years, Lyra Moonshadow. Long before you were born, your wolf stalked my sleep, a creature of shadow and moonlight that bowed to no Alpha, that answered to no call but the mountain's own." He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek where the hunt sigil still marked her as outcast. The touch sent a jolt through Lyra's system, a spark of connection that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. "I do not believe in coincidence," Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a rumble. "The mountain chose you, as it once chose me. For what purpose I do not yet know, but I intend to find out." Morgan, who had been examining the book with reverent care, looked up sharply. "The Ravager stirs beyond our borders," he warned. "If the prophecy is true, if the mountain's power truly wanes, he will sense it. He will come." Thorn's expression hardened. "Let him come. Ironheart has stood against greater threats." "Not without the mountain's blessing," Morgan countered, his aged voice suddenly firm. "Not without the fire in your blood, my king, and that fire dims with each passing season." A flash of something like pain crossed Thorn's face, quickly suppressed. "Then we must find a way to rekindle it," he said, his gaze returning to Lyra. She felt the weight of his scrutiny, the unspoken expectations suddenly placed upon her shoulders. From Omega to Key in the space of a day, from despised to essential. The whiplash of changing status made her head spin. "I want to see this Omega tested," Thorn declared, turning to Garrett. "Prepare the Great Hall. The pack will witness what we have found." Garrett nodded, though concern flickered in his eyes. "The pack is restless, my king. News of the hunters' deaths has spread. There are those who call for the Omega's blood." Thorn's smile was cold and without mirth. "Then they will learn the cost of defying their Alpha." The Great Hall of Ironheart Fortress was a cavernous space carved from the living heart of the mountain. Massive pillars of unadorned stone supported a ceiling so high that the upper reaches were lost in shadow. Torches blazed in iron sconces, their light reflecting off the polished floor in pools of flickering gold. The entire pack had assembled, hundreds strong, arranged according to rank and status. The betas stood closest to the Alpha's dais, proud warriors with the scars of battle evident on their powerful frames. Behind them came the Gammas, the craftsmen and healers, the lifeblood of the pack's daily existence. And at the back, pressed against the walls, stood the Omegas, their eyes downcast, their postures submissive. Thorn sat upon the Alpha's throne, a massive chair carved from the heart of an ancient oak, its arms worn smooth by generations of rulers. His expression was impassive, betraying none of the tumultuous thoughts that Morgan's revelations had sparked. Lyra stood before him, no longer wearing his cloak, but a simple gray shift that did nothing to disguise the new strength evident in her stance. The hunt sigil still marked her cheek, but her eyes held a confidence that no Omega had ever displayed in living memory. The hall buzzed with whispered conversations, speculation and rumor flowing like water. Many had heard fragments of what had transpired in the Blackwood Forest, but few knew the full story. All eyes were fixed on the Omega, who had somehow survived the hunt and won the Alpha's protection. Thorn raised a hand and silence fell as if a blade had cut through the noise. He rose from his throne, his powerful frame seeming to expand with the weight of his authority. "The hunt of the blood moon has revealed something unexpected," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to the furthest corners of the hall. "The Omega Lyra Moonshadow has awakened a wolf of extraordinary power, a wolf that has lain dormant until the moment of greatest need." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, quickly stilled by a glance from their alpha. "Some among you may question my decision to bring her here rather than executing her for the deaths of 5 of our hunters," Thorn continued, his tone hardening. "Let me be clear. The hunt is a sacred tradition, governed by laws as old as our pack itself. The hunters violated those laws when they pursued their quarry onto forbidden ground. Their deaths are on their own heads." A brave or foolish beta stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "My brother was among those slain," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "He was a warrior of the highest standing. Are we to believe he was defeated fairly by an Omega who had never before manifested a wolf?" Thorn's golden eyes fixed on the speaker, his gaze so intense that the beta involuntarily took a step back. "Your brother died because he underestimated his opponent, a fatal error in any battle. As for fairness, when has nature ever concerned itself with such a concept? The strong survive, the weak perish. This is the law of the mountain and of our kind." The beta's mouth opened as if to protest further, but a warning growl from Garrett silenced him. He retreated, though resentment still smoldered in his eyes. Thorn turned his attention back to Lyra. "The Omega will now demonstrate the power that has awakened within her," he declared. "She will shift before the assembled pack, that all may witness what the mountain has bestowed." Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. She had shifted only once, in a moment of desperate survival. Could she summon the wolf at will? What if it refused to come, leaving her exposed and vulnerable before the entire pack? As if sensing her doubt, Thorn stepped closer. "Remember the cave," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "The wolf is not separate from you. It is you, in your truest form." Lyra took a deep breath, centering herself as she closed her eyes. She reached within, seeking the presence that had saved her life in the forest. The wolf was there, watching through her eyes, its power a constant hum beneath her skin. This time, the shift was not born of rage or fear, but of will. It was still painful, bones cracking and reforming, skin splitting to accommodate her larger form. But there was also a fierce joy in the transformation, a rightness that sang in her blood. When she opened her eyes, the world had transformed. Scents and sounds assaulted her enhanced senses, a symphony of information that her human form could never have processed. She saw the awe and terror on the faces of the assembled pack, saw the way they involuntarily stepped back from her massive form. In the shifted state, she stood taller than any wolf present, her midnight fur absorbing the torchlight, her silver eyes gleaming with an inner radiance. She was beautiful and terrible, a creature from the oldest stories, made flesh and fang. Thorn circled her, studying her transformed body with the critical eye of a warrior assessing a weapon. "Magnificent," he murmured, genuine appreciation in his voice. Then, to the astonishment of all present, he began to shift as well. His transformation was smooth and controlled, decades of practice evident in the fluid way his body reconfigured. Where Lyra was shadow, Thorn was fire, his fur the deep burnished gold of autumn leaves, his eyes retaining their human color but magnified in intensity. The alpha wolf was massive in his own right, though not quite matching Lyra's impossible proportions. He radiated power and control, every movement precise and deliberate. Whispers rippled through the hall. The alpha rarely shifted in public, considering it beneath his dignity to display his wolf form except in battle or sacred rituals. That he would do so now, for an Omega, was unprecedented. The two wolves faced each other, gold and shadow, experience and raw power. Then, in a gesture that sent shock waves through the assembled pack, Thorn did the unthinkable. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, one apex predator recognizing another. Instinctively, Lyra responded in kind, a gesture of mutual respect rather than dominance or submission. It was a moment of perfect balance, a recognition that transcended the rigid hierarchy that had governed the pack for 1,000 years. Around them, the spectral form of Thorn's spirit wolf manifested, a silver phantom that circled the physical wolves, its ghostly muzzle grazing both of their fur. It was a blessing, a recognition, a binding. Thorn shifted back to his human form, his expression unreadable as he faced the stunned silence of his pack. He extended a hand toward Lyra, who also reverted to her human shape, the shift back leaving her dizzy but exhilarated. "Behold," Thorn proclaimed, his voice ringing with authority, "the moonbound, foretold in the oldest prophecies. She comes not as our destruction, but as our salvation. From this day forward, Lyra Moonshadow is under my personal protection. Any harm done to her is harm done to me and will be punished accordingly." He turned to face her directly, his golden eyes holding a new intensity. "The hunt sigil marks you as prey," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "That designation is no longer accurate." With deliberate slowness, he reached out and traced the mark on her cheek with his thumb. Where he touched, warmth spread, the cut healing instantly, the scar fading until no trace remained. In its place, a new mark appeared, not carved into flesh, but manifesting like a tattoo just beneath the skin. A crescent moon, identical to the one on her palm, declaring her status as something entirely new. "You are moonbound," Thorn declared. "Neither Alpha nor Omega, but something our pack has not seen in 1,000 years. You will sit at my right hand. You will learn our ways, our strengths, our weaknesses, and when the time comes, you will help us face the darkness that approaches from beyond our borders." He turned back to the assembled pack, his expression brooking no defiance. "This is my will. This is pack law." The hall remained silent for a long moment, the enormity of what had transpired sinking in. Then, one by one, beginning with Garrett and spreading outward like ripples in a pond, the pack members bowed their heads in acceptance. Not all faces showed agreement. Some were carefully blank, hiding thoughts too dangerous to display openly. Others showed open resentment or fear, but none dared to challenge the Alpha's decree, at least not in this moment. Thorn extended his hand to Lyra, a gesture both public and deeply personal. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her smaller hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. As their palms touched, the crescent moon marks on both their hands flared with silver light, visible to every eye in the hall. Another shock rippled through the gathering. The Alpha bore the same mark as the former Omega? What could it mean? Thorn showed no surprise, as if he had known this would happen. With regal confidence, he guided Lyra to the seat at his right hand, the position that had stood empty for decades, since the death of the last Luna. As she sat, Lyra caught the eye of Morgan, who stood in the shadows at the edge of the dais. The old advisor's expression was unreadable, but for an instant she thought she saw something like triumph flash across his weathered features. The feast began, servers bringing platters of roasted meat and pitchers of rich, dark ale. Thorn ate with appetite, seemingly unconcerned by the stir his actions had caused. Beside him, Lyra barely touched her food, her mind racing with the implications of all that had occurred. From hunted to honored in the space of a day. From forgotten to focal point. Her old life had been swept away like leaves before a storm, replaced by something both wondrous and terrifying. She had no illusions about her situation. Thorn had not elevated her out of kindness or justice, but because she represented something he needed, a tool to address the threat he sensed approaching, the key to the mountain's renewal, but also potentially the instrument of its sealing forever. As if sensing her thoughts, Thorn leaned toward her, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "The path ahead will not be easy," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "There are those within these walls who would see you dead, and beyond our borders, enemies who would use you for their own ends." Lyra turned to meet his gaze, finding it unexpectedly intense, almost hungry. "Why did you spare me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the cave. You could have let the council have their justice. You could have eliminated a potential threat to your rule." Thorn was silent for a long moment, studying her with those golden eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "I have ruled this pack for 40 years, he finally said. "I have led them through war and peace, feast and famine. I have been their judge, their general, their executioner when necessary. But in all that time, I have never found what the first Alpha sought when he climbed this mountain and claimed it for our kind." "And what was that?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious. "Balance," Thorn answered, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The harmony between the wolf's strength and the mountain's wisdom. It was this balance that gave the early Alphas their greatest power, a connection to the primal forces that shaped our world. Over time, that connection weakened, the blood thinned, the mountain's voice grew distant. He looked out over the assembled pack, his expression suddenly weary. "I am the last of my line," he continued. "When I am gone, the connection may be lost entirely, unless—" "Unless what?" Lyra prompted when he fell silent. Thorn's eyes returned to hers, and for an instant she glimpsed something unexpected behind his mask of control. Vulnerability, hope. "Unless the prophecy speaks true," he said. "Unless you are indeed the key to renewal." Before Lyra could respond, a commotion at the hall's entrance drew everyone's attention. A scout burst in, his clothes torn, his face pale with exhaustion. He staggered to the Alpha's dais and fell to his knees. "My king," he gasped, his voice ragged. "The border outposts along the eastern ridge have fallen. The Ravager's forces have crossed into our territory." A shocked murmur ran through the hall. The Ravager, the monstrous Alpha who had once been Thorn's blood brother before ambition, turned him traitor. For years he had tested their borders, probing for weakness, but never before had he dared to launch a full invasion. Thorn rose, his face a thundercloud. "How many?" he demanded. "Hundreds," the scout replied, swaying with fatigue. "Perhaps 1,000. They move like shadows, killing everything in their path. They will reach the outer settlements by dawn." Thorn turned to Garrett, already issuing commands. "Muster the war party. Every able-bodied Beta and Gamma. We intercept them at Thunder Pass." As the hall erupted into organized chaos, Thorn's hand fell on Lyra's shoulder, his grip firm. "And now," he said, his voice grim with certainty, "we discover if you are truly the salvation the prophecy promises, or merely another weapon for me to wield against the coming darkness." Lyra met his gaze without flinching, the wolf within her rising to the challenge. "And if I am neither?" she asked. "If I am simply myself, neither savior nor sword?" Something like respect flickered in Thorn's golden eyes. "Then we shall face the Ravager, as we always have," he replied, "with fang and claw, and the stubborn refusal to surrender what is ours." He straightened, once more the unquestioned Alpha, his momentary vulnerability hidden behind the mask of command. "Prepare yourself, Moonbound," he ordered. "The true hunt begins at dawn." Dawn arrived with the reluctance of a sinner approaching confession. Pale light crept over the eastern ridge, revealing a landscape shrouded in mist that clung to the valley like a mourner's veil. From the high window of the northern tower, Lyra watched the awakening world, her mind as unsettled as the shifting fog below. The chamber Thorn had assigned her was both prison and sanctuary, circular and spacious, its stone walls adorned with ancient tapestries depicting wolves racing beneath star-filled skies. A massive bed dominated the center, piled high with furs and silks, more luxury than Lyra had ever known in her life as an Omega. Yet for all its comforts, the room remained a gilded cage, with guards stationed outside her door day and night, ostensibly for her protection. Sleep had proven elusive, her newly awakened wolf restless within her skin, sensing the approach of something momentous. The border incursion reported last night had set the fortress into frenzied preparation for war. Through the night, she had heard the distant clamor of weapons being sharpened, armor being fitted, warriors being marshaled. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Without waiting for a response, the door swung open, and Morgan Wiseheart entered. The ancient advisor moved with surprising grace for one so old, his rheumy eyes sharp and alert despite the early hour. "The Alpha requests your presence in the sacred chamber," he announced, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "There is much you must learn before the War Council convenes." Lyra turned from the window. "What happened to the border outposts? Has there been word?" Morgan's face remained impassive. "The survivors have returned. Their tales will freeze the blood in your veins, but that is not your concern. Not yet. Come." He led her through the winding corridors of Ironheart Fortress, deeper into the mountain's heart. The halls were unusually empty, most of the pack occupied with war preparations or gathered in the Great Hall awaiting orders. Those few they encountered gave Lyra a wide berth, their expressions ranging from fearful reverence to barely concealed hostility. The sacred chamber lay at the end of a narrow passage lit by torches that burned with an unusual blue flame. Unlike the sparse room where the book of the first pack was kept, this chamber was vast and cathedral-like, its ceiling lost in shadow above. At its center burned a fire pit sunken into the stone floor, but the flames were not the orange and red of normal fire. They flickered with an eerie blue-white light that cast everything in ghostly illumination. Thorn already waited there, standing before the supernatural flames, his powerful frame silhouetted against the uncanny light. He wore battle leathers, functional rather than ceremonial, and his hair was pulled back in a warrior's knot. He looked older in this light, the lines of strain more evident on his face. "Leave us," he commanded without turning. Morgan bowed and withdrew, the heavy door closing behind him with a sound of finality. For a long moment, Thorn remained silent, staring into the flames as if they held answers to unasked questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was unusually subdued. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, gesturing to the fire pit. Lyra approached cautiously, drawn by an inexplicable pull from the blue flames. "No, but it feels alive somehow." Thorn nodded, something like approval flickering across his stern features. "It is the mountain's heart, or rather, a physical manifestation of it. The true heart lies far beneath us, in caverns no living soul has visited in centuries." He reached toward the flames, allowing them to lick at his palm without apparent harm. "This fire has burned continuously for 1,000 years, since the first Alpha claimed this mountain for our kind. Its strength reflects the health of our connection to the primal powers that dwell within the earth." Lyra noticed now what her initial awe had obscured. The flames, though beautiful, burned low and weak, barely reaching above the rim of the pit. "It's dying," she observed. "Yes." The single word carried the weight of decades of concern. "When I was a young wolf, these flames reached halfway to the ceiling. They roared with power, feeding the strength of every member of the pack. Now they struggle to survive." He turned to face her fully, his golden eyes reflecting the ghostly light. "The mountain is dying, Lyra, and with it, the source of our power. That is why the Ravager moves against us now. He senses our weakness." "And you think I can change this?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "I'm just one wolf. Until yesterday, I wasn't even that." Thorn's expression darkened. "You are the moonbound. Do you know what that means?" When she shook her head, he continued. "In the oldest days, when the division between our world and the spirit realm was thinner, there existed wolves who were chosen by the moon itself, not merely shifters like the rest of us, but creatures of dual nature, with one paw in the physical world and one in the realm of spirits." He began to pace around the fire pit, his movements those of a caged predator. The moonbound served as conduits, channels through which the mountain's power could flow unimpeded. They renewed the pack's connection to the primal forces, ensuring our strength for generations. "What happened to them?" Lyra asked, already suspecting the answer. "They became too powerful," Thorn replied, confirming her fears. "The Alphas grew jealous, fearful of those who could communicate directly with the powers they merely borrowed. One by one, the moonbound were hunted down, their bloodlines extinguished, until they passed from history into legend." He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the pine and stone scent that was uniquely his. But the mountain remembers, the moon remembers, and now, when our need is greatest, they have chosen you. Lyra felt the weight of his expectations like a physical burden. How can you be sure? I could just be an anomaly, a freak occurrence. Because I have seen you in my dreams for a century, he answered, his voice dropping to a rumble. Long before you were born, your wolf stalked my sleeping mind. At first, I thought these visions a warning of some future enemy. Later, I came to understand they heralded something far more complex. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the crescent moon mark on her cheek with unexpected gentleness. The same mark appeared on my palm 60 years ago, after I claimed the Alpha's throne. I kept it hidden, fearing the Elders' reaction. They cling to the old prejudices, the old fears. Lyra's mind reeled with the implications. If what you say is true, if I am this moonbound, what am I supposed to do? How can I possibly help against an invading army? Thorn's hand fell away from her face. The Ravager is more than just a rival Alpha. He was once my blood brother, Kaldor Bloodmoon, the most gifted warrior of our generation. We fought side by side in the Great Northern War, saved each other's lives a dozen times over. Pain flickered across his features, ancient and unhealed. But Kaldor grew hungry for power beyond what nature intended. He delved into forbidden magics, sacrificed innocence to gain strength not his by right. He found a way to consume the essence of other Alphas, absorbing their power into himself. Thorn turned back to the fire, his voice hardening. When I discovered his betrayal, I confronted him. The battle lasted 3 days and 3 nights. I defeated him barely, but could not bring myself to end his life. Instead, I exiled him beyond our borders, thinking time would heal his madness. He laughed, a harsh sound utterly devoid of humor. Another failure to add to my growing list. He returned a decade later as the Ravager, his body twisted by the dark powers he had embraced. No trace remaining of the brother I had loved. Lyra struggled to process everything she was hearing. What does this have to do with me? The Ravager cannot be defeated by conventional means, Thorn explained. His stolen power makes him nearly invulnerable. But the Moonbound, connected directly to the primal forces he has corrupted, might stand against him. You could be the weapon we have lacked in our long struggle. The wolf within Lyra bristled at being called a weapon, a tool to be wielded by another's hand. She took a step back, creating distance between herself and the Alpha. And if I refuse? If I walk away from this war that isn't mine? Thorn's golden eyes flashed with momentary anger, quickly controlled. Where would you go, Lyra Moonshadow? The pack that despised you yesterday will not suddenly welcome you today. The power awakening within you marks you as either savior or threat, nothing in between. His expression softened fractionally. Besides, this war is yours, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The Ravager will sense your awakening. He will hunt you more relentlessly than any pack member ever did. At least here, you have the mountain's protection, and mine. Before Lyra could respond, the chamber door opened. Garrett entered, his expression grim, blood staining his leather armor. "My king," he said, bowing his head in deference. "The survivors from the eastern outposts bring dire news. The Ravager's forces move faster than we anticipated. They will reach Thunder Pass by midday." Thorn's posture shifted, the vulnerability of moments before vanishing beneath the mantle of leadership. "Muster the War Council. We ride within the hour." Garrett hesitated, his eyes flickering to Lyra. "And the Moonbound?" The Elders question the wisdom of bringing her into battle when her powers are untested. "The Elders forget their place," Thorn growled. "The Moonbound rides with me. Her testing begins today." When Garrett had gone, Thorn turned back to Lyra. "You have until midday to decide your path, Lyra Moonshadow. Weapon or wolf, prisoner or ally, the choice is yours. But choose you must, for the luxury of indecision is one neither of us can afford." With that, he strode from the chamber, leaving Lyra alone with the flickering blue flames and the weight of impossible expectations. Morgan found her still there an hour later, staring into the weakened heart fire as if it might whisper guidance. The old advisor carried a bundle wrapped in aged leather, which he placed on a stone bench near the fire pit. "I thought you might desire more appropriate attire for the journey ahead," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal clothing unlike any Lyra had seen before. A tunic of supple leather dyed midnight blue, trousers of the same material, and a cloak that seemed to shimmer with embedded silver thread that caught the firelight like captured stars. "These belong to the last known moonbound," Morgan explained, as Lyra ran her fingers over the strange fabric. "Ilara Nightwalker, who lived nearly 5 centuries ago. They have been preserved in the deepest vaults, awaiting the moon's next chosen." Lyra looked up sharply. "You knew this would happen? You expected me?" Morgan's weathered face creased in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I have served 6 alphas across 2 centuries, child. I have learned to prepare for all eventualities, even those deemed impossible by lesser minds." He gestured to the garments. "The fabric is woven with moon silver, a metal that no longer exists in our world. It will aid your transformations, make them less painful, more controlled. It will also serve as armor against mundane weapons." Lyra lifted the tunic, surprised by its lightness. "Why are you helping me? Most of the pack would prefer me dead." Morgan's expression grew calculating. "The pack is short-sighted, concerned only with immediate dominance and survival. I take a longer view. The Moonbound were once the true power behind the Alpha's throne, the connection between our mundane existence and the greater powers that shape our world." His voice dropped, taking on an intensity that belied his frail appearance. "Do you know what it is like to watch something great diminish? To see a mighty river reduced to a trickle? I have witnessed the slow decline of our kind for centuries, powerless to prevent it. But now, with your emergence, there is hope for renewal." There was something in his manner that unsettled Lyra, a fervor that seemed excessive even given the circumstances. But before she could question him further, he withdrew to the chamber's entrance. "I will leave you to prepare," he said. "The War Council gathers in the Great Hall. You would be wise not to keep the Alpha waiting." Alone once more, Lyra changed into the ancient garments. They fit as if made for her, the leather soft against her skin, the cloak settling around her shoulders with comforting weight. Power thrummed through the moon-silver threads, resonating with something deep within her, making her wolf stir in recognition of kindred energy. The journey to Thunder Pass was a grim procession. 200 of the pack's finest warriors accompanied Thorn, moving at a pace that would have exhausted ordinary humans within minutes. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own preparations for the battle to come. Lyra ran at Thorn's right hand, a position that did not go unnoticed by the other warriors. Some glanced at her with undisguised resentment, others with cautious hope. Garrett, loping alongside them, maintained a careful neutrality, though Lyra occasionally caught him studying her with speculative eyes. The wolf within her gloried in the freedom of movement, in the feel of earth beneath her feet and wind in her hair. She had spent her life in confinement, literal and figurative, trapped by her perceived weakness and the limitations placed upon her. Now, with each stride, she felt the boundaries of her former existence receding. Thunder Pass lived up to its name. Even from miles away, they could hear the constant rumble of water cascading down sheer cliff faces into the narrow valley below. The path through the mountains narrowed here to a bottleneck barely 30 feet across, hemmed in by towering stone walls that rose hundreds of feet into the sky. The strategic importance was immediately clear even to Lyra's untrained eye. Any force attempting to move through the pass could be easily contained by a much smaller defending army. It was the perfect place for an ambush, which made the Ravagers' direct approach all the more concerning. Thorn called a halt atop the last ridge before the pass. From this vantage point, they could see the entire valley spread before them like a map. The mist had burned away under the midday sun, revealing a landscape of terrible beauty. Ancient pines clung to the lower slopes, giving way to bare rock and scree higher up. The pass itself was a jagged wound in the earth, as if some giant blade had cleaved the mountain in two. Of the Ravager's forces, there was no sign. "They should be here by now," Garrett murmured, scanning the eastern approach with narrowed eyes, unless the scouts were mistaken about their speed. Thorne stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. "They were not mistaken," he said after a long moment. "The Ravager comes, but not as we expected." As if summoned by his words, a change came over the valley. A shadow passed across the sun, though no cloud marred the clear blue sky. The temperature dropped precipitously, frost forming on rock and vegetation alike. The constant thunder of the waterfalls faltered, then ceased entirely as the cascading water froze mid-fall, transformed into grotesque ice sculptures that caught the wan light. An unnatural silence fell, broken only by the nervous shifting of the warriors as they drew closer together, hands moving to weapons, eyes scanning for threats they could not yet see. "What is this?" Lyra whispered, her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "What's happening?" Thorne's expression was grim. "The Ravager's magic grows stronger. He bends the natural world to his will, corrupting it as he himself is corrupted." From the eastern end of the pass, a mist began to form, thick and oily, clinging to the ground like a living thing. It moved against the wind, flowing uphill with deliberate purpose, tendrils reaching ahead like questing fingers. "Form ranks," Thorne commanded, his voice carrying easily to every warrior present. "Archers to the high ground, blades in the front. Garrett, take 20 and secure our retreat path." As the pack moved to obey, Thorne turned to Lyra. "Stay close to me," he ordered. "Whatever happens, whatever you see, do not engage the Ravager directly. Your time will come, but not today." The mist continued its inexorable advance, now close enough that Lyra could smell it, a foul odor of decay and corruption that made her wolf recoil in disgust. Within the murky depths, shapes began to materialize, humanoid but wrong somehow, moving with jerky, uncoordinated motions. The first creatures to emerge from the fog bore only passing resemblance to wolves or humans. They had once been shifters, that much was clear, but their forms had been twisted almost beyond recognition. Their limbs were too long, their joints bending in impossible directions. Their faces were flattened nightmares, with too many teeth crammed into elongated jaws. Their eyes burned with a sickly yellow light, devoid of any intelligence or mercy. Behind these abominations came more conventional troops, shifters who retained their natural form, but whose expressions held the vacant stare of the enthralled. They moved in perfect unison, puppets dancing to an unseen master's strings. "The Ravager's thralls," Thorne explained, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Former members of conquered packs, their wills subsumed by his corrupted power. They are no longer themselves, merely extensions of his consciousness." Lyra felt sick. Can they be saved? Thorne's golden eyes flashed with momentary pain. "No. The kindest fate we can offer them is a swift death." The army of twisted creatures and vacant-eyed thralls continued to pour from the mist, their numbers far greater than the scouts had reported. Hundreds became thousands, filling the valley floor from wall to wall, a tide of corruption advancing inexorably toward the Ironheart defenders. Thorne raised his hand, and his warriors braced themselves, weapons ready, muscles tensed for the coming onslaught. But before he could give the signal to attack, the enemy forces halted as one, creating an eerie tableau of suspended violence. The mist at the center of the valley began to churn and condense, forming a pillar that rose 30 feet into the air before taking shape. The figure that emerged was both familiar and utterly alien, a perversion of the wolf's noble form. The Ravager stood twice the height of a normal man, his body a grotesque hybrid of human and wolf. Matted fur the color of dried blood covered a frame bulging with unnatural muscle. His face was a nightmare mask, half bestial muzzle, half human features frozen in a perpetual snarl. But most disturbing were his eyes, not the yellow of his thralls, but deep, bottomless pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Thorn Blackthorn," the monster rumbled, its voice like stone grinding against stone. Still clinging to your crumbling mountain, I see. Still playing at being alpha when the power has all but left your blood. Thorn stepped forward, positioning himself between the Ravager and his warriors. Kaldor, he replied, deliberately using the creature's original name. You look worse every time we meet. The magic you stole does not agree with you. The Ravager laughed, a sound like breaking glass that sent shivers down Lyra's spine. The magic I claimed, brother, as I will claim your mountain, your pack, and the last dregs of power in your fading bloodline. His pit-like eyes swept over the assembled defenders, lingering briefly on Lyra. A flicker of surprise crossed his monstrous features, quickly replaced by hungry interest. What's this? He mused, head tilting in an unnervingly bird-like motion. You found yourself a moonbound? How unexpected, and how convenient for me to have such a prize delivered to my doorstep. Snai. Thorn's posture shifted subtly, moving to block the Ravager's view of Lyra. Your quarrel is with me, Kaldor. It always has been. The Ravager's grotesque mouth stretched in what might have been a smile. My quarrel is with anything that stands between me and absolute power. But I am not unreasonable. Surrender the moonbound to me, and I will grant your pack mercy. Resist, and I will feast on your entrails while she watches. A growl rippled through the Ironheart ranks, wolves bristling at the threat to their alpha. Thorn remained outwardly calm, though Lyra could sense the rage building within him. You know my answer, Thorn replied, his voice steady. You have always known it. No surrender, no retreat, not while I draw breath. The Ravager sighed, an oddly human gesture from such a monstrous form. Then we proceed as always, brother, with blood and pain and the inevitable outcome. He raised a massive, clawed hand, and the army of thralls surged forward, a wave of corruption breaking against the Ironheart defenders. The battle erupted with savage intensity, the narrow pass filling with the sounds of combat, growls and screams mingling with the clash of weapons. Thorn shifted in an instant, his golden wolf form launching into the fray with deadly precision. Lyra found herself surrounded by swirling chaos, her untrained human instincts at war with the wolf's battle hunger. Around her, the pack fought with disciplined ferocity, each warrior moving in concert with those around them, a testimony to decades of training. A thrall broke through the front line, charging directly at Lyra with vacant eyes and bared fangs. Without conscious thought, she shifted, her transformation smoother and less painful than before, aided by the moonsilver in her garments. The black wolf met the attacker head-on, massive jaws closing around a throat that offered no resistance. The kill brought no satisfaction, only a hollow pity for the empty shell that had once been a living, thinking creature. But there was no time for reflection. More thralls pressed forward, and Lyra found herself fighting for survival, relying on instinct and raw power where skill and experience were lacking. Time lost meaning amid the rhythm of attack and counter, the metallic taste of blood, the acrid smell of fear and fury. Lyra fought her way toward Thorn, drawn by an inexplicable need to remain near the Alpha. She found him at the center of the battlefield, a golden whirlwind of destruction, his centuries of experience evident in every calculated move. Together, they carved a path through the enemy ranks, working with an instinctive coordination that required no words or signals. Where Thorn was precision and economy, Lyra was raw power and unpredictability. They complemented each other perfectly, as if they had trained together for years rather than met mere days ago. The battles seemed to be turning in their favor, the superior discipline and motivation of the Ironheart warriors beginning to tell against the mindless aggression of the thralls. But then the Ravager himself entered the fray, his corrupted form wading through the combat like a colossus, swatting aside defenders as if they were troublesome insects. He headed directly for Thorn, his intention clear. This was and always had been a personal battle, a rivalry that had festered for decades. The two ancient enemies met in a clash that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Golden wolf against crimson monstrosity, purity against corruption. Lyra found herself forced away from the duel by a fresh wave of thralls, their vacant eyes now fixed on her as if following some unheard command. They seemed determined to separate her from Thorn, to isolate her from the main battle. Understanding dawned with chilling clarity. This entire attack had been a trap, designed to draw out the moonbound the Ravager had somehow sensed. Fighting with renewed desperation, Lyra tried to break through the encircling enemies, but for every thrall she downed, 2 more took its place. A cold certainty settled in her gut. She could not win this battle alone, not yet, not without the training and knowledge she had been denied all her life. From the corner of her eye, she saw Thorn falter, a lucky strike from the Ravager opening a deep wound in his flank. The Alpha recovered quickly, but the momentary weakness told its own story. Despite his skill and courage, Thorn was aging, his legendary strength beginning to wane. Against the unnatural vigor of the Ravager, fueled by stolen power and dark magic, even the greatest natural warrior must eventually fail. A decision crystallized in Lyra's mind. This was not their day for victory. Survival must take precedence, regrouping to fight again when better prepared. She let out a howl, not of defeat, but of tactical retreat, a sound that carried above the din of battle to reach Thorn's ears. The Alpha's golden eyes met hers across the chaos, understanding passing between them without words. With one powerful leap, he disengaged from the Ravager, rejoining Lyra as Garrett and the remaining warriors formed a protective ring around them. "Fall back," Thorn commanded, his voice carrying despite his injured state. "To the high path! Move!" The retreat was orderly, despite the pressure of pursuing enemies. The Ironheart wolves moved as one, covering each other, ensuring no wounded were left behind. They reached the narrow trail that wound up the eastern wall of the pass, too steep and treacherous for the Ravager's twisted abominations to follow easily. From the valley floor, the Ravager watched their retreat, making no move to pursue. His laughter echoed off the stone walls, a sound of cruel satisfaction that chilled Lyra to her core. "Run, brother!" he called after them. "Run back to your crumbling fortress. Lick your wounds and wait for the inevitable. The moonbound cannot save you. Nothing can." Thorn did not respond, conserving his strength for the journey home, but his golden eyes burned with a promise of future reckoning. The return to Ironheart Fortress was a somber procession. Of the 200 warriors who had ridden out that morning, barely half returned, and many of those bore injuries that would take weeks to heal. They carried their dead with them, unwilling to leave any packmate to the desecration the Ravager would surely inflict. Morgan awaited them at the fortress gates, his ancient face creasing with concern as he tallied the returning forces. "So few," he murmured. "And the Ravager?" "Stronger than we anticipated," Thorn replied grimly. "His corruption grows, as does his army. This was merely the first wave. He tests our defenses, our resolve." The wounded were taken to the healing chambers, the dead to the preparation rooms where they would be honored before returning to the mountain's embrace. Thorn, despite his own injuries, remained on his feet, giving orders, ensuring every detail was attended to. Lyra followed him, still wrapped in the strange calm that had descended during the battle. She felt removed from herself, observing her actions from a distance, a common response to the trauma of first combat. The wolf within her was strangely quiet, as if processing all that had occurred. Morgan approached her as Thorn conferred with his remaining captains. "You fought well," the old advisor said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "But fighting is not the way you will win this war." Lyra turned to him, suddenly weary beyond words. "What do you mean?" Morgan glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. "Come to the Eastern Library at midnight. There are things you must know, secrets even the Alpha is not privy to." Before she could question him further, he melted away into the crowd, leaving Lyra with a growing sense of unease. Something in Morgan's manner had changed since her return, a new intensity that bordered on feverish. The hours passed in a blur of activity. Healers attended to the wounded, families mourned their dead. Warriors recounted the battle for those who had remained behind. Through it all, Thorn moved with tireless efficiency, his own injury bound, but clearly paining him. Lyra finally cornered him in a quiet corridor, away from the endless demands for his attention. "You need rest," she said, noting the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. "The pack needs their alpha at full strength." Thorn's golden eyes studied her with an unreadable expression. "You fought well today," he said, ignoring her concern. "Untrained, but with natural instinct. With proper guidance, you could become formidable." "Is that all I am to you?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "A weapon to be honed?" Something flashed across Thorn's face, too quick to interpret. "You are the moonbound," he replied after a moment. "The first in 5 centuries. What you mean to the pack, to the mountain, to the future of our kind, transcends any personal considerations." "And to you?" Lyra pressed, stepping closer. "What am I to you, Thorn Blackthorn?" The Alpha held her gaze, his expression softening fractionally. "A mystery," he admitted. "A challenge to everything I thought I knew. A hope I scarcely dare to acknowledge." He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek, where the crescent moon mark shimmered in the torchlight. "I have ruled alone for 40 years, carrying the weight of the pack's survival on my shoulders. I have made decisions that cost lives, sacrificed my own happiness for the greater good, watched as the power that is my birthright slowly faded despite all my efforts to preserve it." His hand dropped, and he stepped back, his momentary vulnerability once again hidden behind the mask of leadership. "What you are to me personally is irrelevant. What matters is what we can accomplish together, for the pack, for the future." Before Lyra could respond, a commotion erupted down the corridor. Garrett appeared, his expression urgent. "My king," he said, bowing briefly. "The elders have called an emergency council. They question your handling of the battle, your decision to include the moonbound in our forces." A muscle ticked in Thorn's jaw, the only outward sign of his frustration. "Politics," he growled. "Even in the face of extinction, they cling to their petty power struggles." He turned to Lyra. "Rest, recover your strength. Tomorrow we begin your true training." With that, he strode away, Garrett falling into step beside him, leaving Lyra alone with questions that multiplied faster than answers could be found. The Eastern Library was ancient and largely forgotten, its shelves filled with texts so old that the language in which they were written was no longer spoken. Dust lay thick on volumes untouched for centuries, and the air held the peculiar stillness of places long abandoned. Lyra moved through the darkened chamber with cautious steps, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through high, narrow windows. Morgan had said midnight, but the old advisor was nowhere to be seen. A sound from the far corner drew her attention, soft but distinct in the silence. Not footsteps, but the rustle of parchment, the gentle closing of a book. Lyra approached, her enhanced senses alert for any threat, the wolf within her suddenly restless, sensing something amiss. Morgan sat at a small table, partially hidden behind a row of tall shelves. Before him lay an open tome, its pages covered in script that seemed to shift and change even as Lyra looked at it, refusing to resolve into recognizable letters. The old advisor's fingers traced patterns above the book, leaving faint trails of blue light hanging in the air. "You came," he said, without looking up. "Good. There is much to discuss, and precious little time." Lyra remained at a distance, suddenly wary. "What are you doing?" Morgan finally raised his head, and Lyra had to suppress a gasp. His eyes, normally clouded with age, now burned with an inner light similar to the flames in the sacred chamber, a blue-white radiance that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Preparing," he answered, his voice carrying a new resonance that seemed to vibrate in Lyra's bones. "The Ravagers' attack today was merely a prelude. The true battle approaches, a confrontation centuries in the making." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit. What I must tell you cannot be overheard, even by the stone walls of this fortress." Reluctantly, Lyra took the offered seat, careful to maintain distance from both Morgan and the strange book. Why all the secrecy? Why not share this information with Thorn? Morgan's illuminated eyes flashed with something like contempt. Thorn is a warrior, a leader of wolves. His understanding is limited to what he can see, what he can fight. The truth I offer extends far beyond such mundane concerns. He closed the book with a decisive snap, leaning forward with unnerving intensity. What do you know of the mountain's true nature, child? Not the simplified tales told to cubs, but the reality of what lies beneath our feet. Lyra shook her head, increasingly uncomfortable with Morgan's manner. Only what Thorn told me, that it's the source of the pack's power, that the connection is weakening. Morgan laughed, a sound entirely without humor. Weakening. Such a mild term for catastrophic failure. The truth is far more dire. The mountain is not merely a source of power. It is a prison, a cage for something ancient and terrible, something that slept peacefully until human greed disturbed its slumber. He rose, moving to the window where moonlight illuminated his aged features in stark relief. 1,000 years ago, the first Alpha did not claim this mountain, as our histories record. He sacrificed himself to contain a force that would have destroyed everything in its path. His blood, freely given, created a seal that has held this entity at bay for centuries. What does this have to do with me? Lyra asked, though a cold dread was already forming in the pit of her stomach. Morgan turned, his glowing eyes fixing her with unsettling intensity. The seal weakens, as all things must with time. The Ravager knows this. He seeks not conquest but release, believing he can control what lies beneath, use its power to achieve his ambitions. He returned to the table, placing his gnarled hands flat on the surface. The Moonbound were never champions or saviors, Lyra. They were sacrifices, vessels prepared to renew the seal when it faltered. Their blood, infused with the power of both wolf and moon, was the only substance strong enough to reinforce the binding. Horror washed over Lyra as the implications became clear. Thorn knows this? He brought me here to die? Thorn knows only fragments, half-truths passed down through generations of alphas, Morgan replied, his tone almost gentle. He believes you are a weapon against the Ravager, a means to restore the pack's connection to its power source. He does not understand the true cost, or he refuses to acknowledge it. The old advisor leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But there is another way, a path not taken in a millennium. Instead of strengthening the seal, you could break it entirely, releasing what lies beneath, but in a controlled manner. With proper guidance, you could harness this power rather than merely containing it. Proper guidance, Lyra repeated, sudden understanding dawning. Your guidance. Morgan's thin lips stretched in a smile that never reached his eyes. I have waited centuries for this moment, for the emergence of a moonbound strong enough to survive the process. Together, we could remake the world, establish a new order where wolves rule openly, as was always intended. He extended a hand toward her, palm up, revealing a crescent scar identical to the one on Lyra's hand. Join me, Lyra Moonshadow. Free yourself from Thorn's manipulations. Claim the destiny that is rightfully yours. The wolf within Lyra growled, a warning rumble that vibrated through her chest. Every instinct screamed danger, betrayal, wrongness. Why should I trust you? She asked, playing for time as she assessed her options. Why would you help me claim power you clearly desire for yourself? Morgan's expression darkened. My time for wielding such power directly has passed. Age has weakened my body beyond the point where it could channel such energies. But as your guide, your mentor, I would share in your glory. His glowing eyes narrowed, sensing her hesitation. Do not mistake this for a choice, child. The path is set. The ritual approaches. You will serve your purpose, one way or another. With shocking speed for one so ancient, Morgan lunged across the table, his hand closing around Lyra's wrist. Where their skin touched, pain erupted, a burning cold that spread up her arm like poison. "The bond is already forming," Morgan hissed, his voice no longer entirely human. "Your blood calls to the mountain, and it answers. Soon you will have no will but mine." Lyra reacted on instinct, the wolf surging forward in defense. Her free hand struck out, catching Morgan across the face with enough force to send him sprawling. The contact broke, and she leapt back, putting distance between them, fighting the numbing cold still spreading through her arm. Morgan rose, blood trickling from a split lip, his eyes now blazing with undisguised fury. "So be it," he snarled. "We do this the hard way." He began to chant in a language Lyra had never heard, harsh syllables that scraped against her ears like claws on stone. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her hair stand on end. The strange book on the table began to glow, its pages turning of their own accord, faster and faster. Lyra tried to run, but her limbs refused to obey, locked in place by whatever spell Morgan was weaving. The cold from her arm had spread, reaching toward her heart, each beat becoming more labored than the last. Through fading vision, she saw Morgan withdraw a silver dagger from his robes, its blade inscribed with symbols similar to those in the ancient cave. "Your blood freely given would have been preferable," he said, advancing on her paralyzed form. "But taken by force, it will still serve." The world narrowed to the gleaming point of the blade, now inches from her throat. Lyra strained against the invisible bonds, the wolf within her howling in rage and desperation. Just as the knife began to descend, a thunderous crash shook the library. The doors burst open with enough force to tear them from their hinges. Thorn stood in the entrance, his massive frame silhouetted against the corridor lights, his golden eyes blazing with fury. Behind him, Garrett and a dozen guards fanned out, weapons drawn. "Morgan!" Thorn growled, his voice barely recognizable through his rage. "Step away from her!" The old advisor did not move, the knife still poised at Lyra's throat. "You are too late, Alpha," he said, a manic glee suffusing his features. "The binding has begun. Interfere, and she dies instantly." Thorn took a measured step forward, his hands open at his sides in a deceptively casual posture. "How long, Morgan? How long have you played this game, manipulating from the shadows, whispering poison in the ears of those who trusted you?" Morgan's laugh was the sound of breaking glass. "Longer than you can imagine, young king. I have served 6 alphas, guided the pack through centuries of history. And in all that time, I have waited for this moment, this culmination." His glowing eyes fixed on Thorn with undisguised contempt. "You were supposed to be the strongest, the one who would lead us to greatness. Instead, you cling to outdated notions of honor and duty while our power wanes. You are a disappointment, Thorn Blackthorn, a footnote in the grand story I am writing." The knife pressed harder against Lyra's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "The moonbound is mine now. The ritual will proceed. The entity below will be freed, and a new age will dawn for our kind." Thorn's expression did not change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle gathering of muscle and intent. "You speak of the entity as if it were salvation," he said, taking another casual step forward. "But I have read the oldest texts, Morgan. I know what sleeps beneath the mountain. Not power, but destruction. Not a tool, but a devourer of worlds." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Morgan's face. "You understand nothing," he spat. "The first Alpha was a coward, afraid to wield the power within his grasp. I will not make the same mistake." "No," Thorn agreed, now close enough that Lyra could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You'll make a far greater one." With speed that belied his size, Thorn struck. Not at Morgan directly, but at the book on the table, his hand closing around the ancient tome and hurling it toward the fireplace where embers still glowed. The reaction was instantaneous. Morgan screamed, a sound of pure anguish, releasing Lyra to lunge for the precious text. The paralysis broken, Lyra collapsed, her legs unable to support her weight. Garrett was at her side in an instant, dragging her away from the confrontation as Thorn intercepted Morgan's desperate rush. The two met in a clash that shook the foundations of the library. Despite his age, Morgan fought with supernatural strength, his body illuminated from within by the same blue-white light that burned in his eyes. Thorn matched him blow for blow, decades of combat experience compensating for the unnatural power animating his opponent. Bookshelves toppled, ancient texts scattered across the floor as the combatants crashed through the library. The guards moved to assist their alpha, but Thorn waved them back, his focus entirely on his former advisor. "I trusted you," Thorn growled, blocking a strike that would have crushed a normal wolf's skull. "For 40 years you stood at my side, guided me through countless crises. Was it all a lie? Every piece of advice? Every show of loyalty?" Morgan's face contorted with manic rage. "Not a lie," he gasped between blows. "A long game. The longest. You were a means to an end, nothing more. A placeholder until the true power arrived." His glowing eyes flicked to Lyra, still supported by Garrett near the door. "She is the key, the vessel, the sacrifice. Without her blood, the seal fails, and all your struggles will have been for nothing." Thorn's expression hardened into implacable resolve. "Then we will find another way, without betrayal, without the death of innocence." With a roar that seemed to shake the very mountain, Thorn launched a final assault. His hands closed around Morgan's throat, driving the old advisor backward until he slammed against the stone wall. For a moment, they stood frozen in tableau, ancient enemies locked in a contest of wills as much as strength. Then, with terrible finality, Thorn twisted. The sound of breaking vertebrae echoed in the suddenly silent chamber. Morgan's body went limp, the unnatural light fading from his eyes until they were once again the cloudy orbs of an old man, now staring sightlessly at nothing. Thorn released his grip, allowing the body to slide to the floor. He stood over it for a long moment, his broad shoulders rising and falling with exertion, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Burn it," he finally said, nodding toward the book that had somehow survived its journey toward the fire. "Burn it to ash and scatter the remains to the wind." As the guards moved to obey, Thorn turned to Lyra. The cold poison Morgan had inflicted was receding, but she still leaned heavily on Garrett, her limbs weak and trembling. Without a word, Thorn swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. "The healing chambers," he ordered, "and summon the oldest of the elders. We need answers, and I will have them tonight, even if I must tear this mountain apart stone by stone." Lyra rested her head against his shoulder, too exhausted to protest or question. The wolf within her, momentarily cowed by Morgan's magic, reasserted itself, growling contentment at the Alpha's protective embrace. As Thorn carried her from the ruined library, one certainty crystallized in Lyra's mind. Whatever the truth behind Morgan's madness, whatever secret lay buried beneath the mountain, she would face it on her own terms, not as sacrifice or vessel, but as moonbound. Not for Thorn or the pack or even herself, but for the future that hung in the balance, a future suddenly more precious for its precariousness. The mountain had chosen her. Now she would choose her own path. The healing chambers of Ironheart Fortress lay deep within the mountain's heart, where thermal springs fed pools of mineral-rich water believed to hold restorative properties. Steam rose in lazy coils, creating a perpetual mist that clung to stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use. Ancient runes carved into the surrounding rock pulsed with a gentle blue luminescence. The mountain's power concentrated here where the barrier between physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Lyra floated in the largest pool, her body suspended in the warm embrace of waters that smelled faintly of copper and sage. The poison Morgan had introduced into her system had proven stubborn, a cold malevolence that clung to her veins like frost to window glass. 3 days she had remained here, drifting between consciousness and something deeper, a state where time lost meaning and dreams carried the weight of revelation. She was not alone. Thorn had maintained his vigil without interruption, his powerful frame perched on a stone bench at the pool's edge, golden eyes alert despite his evident exhaustion. He had refused all suggestions of rest, all offers to take his place. The betrayal of his most trusted advisor had shaken him to his core, though his iron control allowed only the barest glimpse of this turmoil to show on his weathered face. In her periods of lucidity, Lyra had learned pieces of what had transpired in the aftermath of Morgan's death. The ancient book he had attempted to use in his ritual had indeed been burned, its ashes scattered from the highest tower on the northern wind. The library had been sealed, its dangerous knowledge placed under guard until a proper accounting could be made. And the elders, shaken by the revelation of treachery in their midst, had withdrawn their opposition to Lyra's position, at least temporarily. Questions remained unanswered. What exactly lay imprisoned beneath the mountain? What role had Morgan truly envisioned for her? And most troubling of all, what connection existed between Morgan's plans and the Ravager's sudden aggression? On the morning of the fourth day, Lyra's eyes opened with newfound clarity. The poison had finally receded, leaving behind an awareness sharper than before, as if her senses had been honed by the struggle against Morgan's malevolence. She sat up, water cascading from her shoulders, steam wreathing her like a spectral cloak. Thorn straightened, relief briefly softening the hard lines of his face. He offered her a simple linen wrap, his gaze respectfully averted as she emerged from the pool. The garment was soft against her skin, still warm from contact with his body heat. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Something had shifted between them in the aftermath of Morgan's betrayal, a newfound recognition of shared vulnerability. Thorn was no longer merely the untouchable alpha, but a man bearing wounds both physical and spiritual. And Lyra was no longer simply the moonbound, a weapon or tool to be wielded, but a force with her own purpose, her own path to forge. Morning sunlight filtered through crystal apertures in the chamber's ceiling, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the heated air. Beyond the walls of the healing chamber, they could hear the sounds of a fortress preparing for war. The rhythmic clang of the forge, the shouts of warriors training in the yard, the measured cadence of officers issuing commands. The Ravager's forces had withdrawn after the battle at Thunder Pass, but all knew this was merely a tactical retreat, not an abandonment of his ultimate goal. Thorn finally broke the silence, his deep voice unusually gentle. The mountain's oldest elder, a blind woman named Sierra, whose milky eyes were said to see through time itself, had confirmed what fragments of truth existed within Morgan's madness. The mountain did indeed serve as a prison for an entity of immense power, though its nature remained shrouded in mystery. The first Alpha had sacrificed himself to create the initial seal, and subsequent generations had maintained it, often unknowingly. The Moonbound had indeed played a role in this ancient arrangement, but not as sacrifices as Morgan had claimed. They were guardians, conduits capable of renewing the seal without the catastrophic cost of an Alpha's life. Their disappearance centuries ago had corresponded with a gradual weakening of the mountain's power, as each generation of Alphas was forced to give more of their own essence to maintain what their predecessors had built. And now the seal nears failure, Thorn concluded, his golden eyes grave. The Ravager knows this. He seeks not merely conquest, but release of what lies beneath. He believes he can control it, use it to achieve dominance over all wolfkind. Outside the healing chambers, a horn sounded, 3 long blasts that echoed through the stone corridors. The signal for council assembly, urgent and insistent. Thorn rose, extending a hand to Lyra. No words were needed. The time for recovery had passed, war approached, and decisions must be made. The council chamber had been transformed in the days since Morgan's death. The massive round table remained, but surrounding it now stood detailed maps of the territory, tactical markers showing the last known positions of the Ravager's forces, and ancient scrolls retrieved from secure vaults, their fragile parchment protected by sheets of crystal. The chamber buzzed with controlled energy, pack officers reporting, strategists debating, messengers arriving with fresh intelligence. All activity ceased when Thorn entered with Lyra at his side. The assembled wolves bowed in deference, though many eyes lingered on Lyra with expressions ranging from hopeful to wary. The elders occupied their traditional seats at the table, their aged faces grave with the weight of imminent decisions. Garrett approached, his usually stoic features animated with urgency. Scouts had returned with alarming news. The Ravagers' forces had not retreated to their territory as initially believed. They had instead spread throughout the mountains surrounding Ironheart, establishing forward positions at strategic points. More disturbing still, they appeared to be conducting ritual activities at ancient sites of power, places where the mountain's energy breached the surface in the form of hot springs, magnetic anomalies, and unexplained phenomena. "He strengthens himself," observed Sierra, the blind elder. Her ancient voice carried easily despite its frailty. "Each ritual site corrupted adds to his power and accelerates the weakening of the seal." The implications were clear and dire. Left unchecked, the Ravager would eventually accumulate enough power to breach the mountain's defenses and reach the chamber of binding deep beneath their feet. The entity would be released, and with it, destruction beyond imagining. Debate erupted around the table, strategies proposed and dismissed, options considered and rejected. Some advocated immediate offensive action, striking the Ravagers' forces before they could complete their rituals. Others counseled defensive preparation, strengthening the fortress, and waiting for the enemy to exhaust himself against their walls. A few, mainly the older elders, suggested evacuation, abandoning the mountain to its fate and seeking new territories beyond the Ravagers' reach. Throughout the heated discussion, Thorn remained silent, his golden eyes watchful, weighing each argument with the careful consideration of a leader who understood that lives would be lost based on his decision. Beside him, Lyra studied the maps and tactical markers, her mind working through possibilities unseen by the others. The wolf within her, grown stronger during her convalescence, prowled restlessly beneath her skin. It sensed something the others did not, a pattern in the Ravagers' deployments that spoke to more than military strategy. The ritual sites had been chosen not merely for their power, but for their specific resonance with the seal beneath the mountain. Each one corresponded to a nodal point in the complex spiritual geometry that maintained the entity's prison. Lyra moved forward, drawing all eyes as she approached the largest map. Without asking permission, she placed her hand on the representation of their territory, her crescent mark glowing faintly as it made contact with the parchment. The wolf's understanding flowed through her, guiding her fingers as she traced lines of connection between the ritual sites and Ironheart's position at the center. "He creates a web," she explained, her voice stronger than she expected. "Each corrupted site becomes a strand. When the pattern is complete, he can pull from anywhere along the periphery and the entire structure will collapse." Sierra nodded, her blind eyes somehow finding Lyra unerringly. "The Moonbound sees true. The Ravager works not merely with physical forces, but with the mountain's own spiritual architecture." Thorn finally broke his silence, his deep voice cutting through the chamber's tension. They would neither attack blindly nor wait passively. Instead, they would adopt a strategy of targeted intervention, striking at specific ritual sites to disrupt the Ravagers' pattern while strengthening their own connection to the mountain's power. And most crucially, Lyra would begin training immediately to fulfill her role as Moonbound, not as sacrifice or mere weapon, but as the vital connection between the pack's mundane strength and the mountain's spiritual essence. She would learn to channel the power that Morgan had sought to corrupt, to renew the seal in a way that had not been possible for centuries. The council dispersed with clear purpose, each member tasked with specific preparations. As the chamber emptied, Thorn remained at the table, his powerful frame unusually still, his gaze distant. Lyra approached him, sensing the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders, the responsibility that had been his alone for too long. "You don't have to bear this burden by yourself anymore," she said simply. Thorn looked up, something vulnerable flickering behind his golden eyes. For the first time since their meeting, he allowed his exhaustion to show, the accumulated weariness of decades of solitary leadership. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, in a gesture that held no demand, only recognition of shared purpose. "The training will not be easy," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "The power you must learn to channel has broken stronger wolves than either of us." Lyra met his gaze steadily, the wolf within her rising to the challenge. "Then we'd better begin." The training ground lay atop the fortress's highest tower, a circular platform open to the elements where the barrier between physical and spiritual realms grew thin. Ancient monoliths ringed the perimeter, their surfaces carved with spiraling patterns that caught the light in ways that made the eye slide uncomfortably away. The stone beneath their feet was the deep black of the mountain's heart, absorbing rather than reflecting the sun's rays. Thorn had shed his formal attire for simple training leathers, his powerful body moving with the fluid grace of a predator as he demonstrated the first forms. The training of a moonbound was unlike anything in the pack's current practices, combining physical discipline with spiritual awareness in ways that had been forgotten for centuries. Day bled into night and back again as Lyra struggled to master the fundamentals. Her body, once considered weak by pack standards, revealed unexpected strengths. What she lacked in brute power, she compensated for with speed and adaptability. The wolf within her, no longer a separate entity, but increasingly integrated with her human consciousness, learned alongside her, its instincts complementing her intellect. The most difficult aspects were not physical, but spiritual. Lyra had to learn to perceive the mountain's energy directly, to feel the currents and eddies of power that flowed through stone and air. Thorn guided her with unexpected patience, drawing on knowledge he had gleaned from ancient texts and his own decades of connection to the mountain as Alpha. Weeks passed in this manner, the fortress around them continuing its war preparations. Scouts brought regular reports of the Ravagers' activities, each more concerning than the last. The web of corruption spread, each ritual site a wound in the territory's spiritual fabric. Smaller packs on the periphery fell under the Ravagers' sway, their members either converted to thralls or slaughtered as sacrifices to power his dark rituals. On the night of the full moon, Thorn led Lyra to a place she had never seen before, though it lay at the very center of the fortress. The chamber of binding existed in a space that seemed to defy normal geometry, simultaneously vast and intimate, its walls lined with the same luminescent runes that adorned the healing pools, but here they pulsed with urgent intensity. At the chamber's center stood a column of pure crystal, rising from floor to ceiling, its interior swirling with colors that had no names in any human language. Within this kaleidoscopic prison, a shadow moved, formless yet somehow suggesting immense size, ancient malevolence, and patient hunger. "This is what lies beneath," Thorn said, his voice hushed with appropriate reverence. "This is what we guard, what the first Alpha gave his life to contain." The entity within the crystal seemed to sense their presence. The shadow pressed against its prison walls, the colors swirling faster, more violently. A pressure built in the air, a sense of attention focused with terrible intensity. Lyra felt it reach toward her mind, searching for entry, offering knowledge, power, freedom from all constraints. The wolf within her growled, hackles raised against the intrusion. This was no natural creature, no part of the world's proper order. It was wrong in ways that defied articulation, its very existence an affront to the balance of nature. Thorn's hand closed around hers, his warmth anchoring her against the entity's pull. Together they withdrew, sealing the chamber behind them. The encounter, brief as it was, had served its purpose. Lyra now understood precisely what they fought to contain, what the Ravager sought to release. The stakes could not have been higher, nor the consequences of failure more catastrophic. That night marked a turning point in their preparation. Lyra's training intensified, moving beyond forms and disciplines to practical application. She learned to channel the mountain's energy in focused bursts, to heal wounds with a touch, to communicate across vast distances through the stone itself. Most importantly, she began to understand the structure of the seal, the intricate spiritual geometry that kept the entity contained. And as her power grew, so too did her connection to Thorn. What had begun as reluctant alliance deepened into partnership, then friendship, and finally something more profound. They moved together with increasing synchronicity, anticipating each other's thoughts, complementing each other's strengths. The Alpha and the Moonbound, Gold and Shadow, experience and innovation, traditional power and transformative change. The fortress became a hive of activity as winter gave way to spring. Warriors trained in new tactics designed to counter the Ravagers' corrupted forces. Healers prepared remedies for wounds both physical and spiritual. Craftsmen forged weapons imbued with protective runes under Sierra's blind but unerring guidance. Through it all, a sense of purpose replaced the initial fear. The pack, once divided in their response to Lyra's emergence, united behind her as evidence of her dedication became impossible to ignore. She was no longer the Omega outcast, but the Moonbound, a living link to their oldest traditions, a promise of renewal rather than destruction. The Ravagers' first major assault came with the spring thaw, when mountain passes cleared enough to allow large forces to move freely. A war host numbering thousands approached from the east, led by the monstrous figure of the Ravager himself, now grown even more twisted as corrupted power reshaped his physical form. Scouts reported that he stood twice his previous height, his body a grotesque fusion of wolf and something older, darker, with too many limbs and eyes that burned with stolen fire. Thorn met the threat head-on, leading a force of 500 warriors to intercept the enemy at a narrow valley 3 days' march from the fortress. Lyra rode at his side, clad in the moon-silver garments that now fit her like a second skin. Around her neck hung a crystal pendant containing a single drop of water from the mountain's heart, a focus for her growing power. The battle erupted beneath a cloudless sky, the beauty of the spring day a stark contrast to the horror unfolding beneath it. The Ravagers' forces attacked without strategy or self-preservation, wave after wave of thralls hurling themselves against the Ironheart defenders. What they lacked in skill, they compensated for with sheer numbers and a terrifying disregard for their own safety. Thorn fought with the calculated precision of a master warrior, each movement economical, each strike lethal. His golden wolf form moved through the chaos like a flame through darkness, rallying the defenders, turning back enemy advances, inspiring by example rather than command. Garrett coordinated the flanking maneuvers, his tactical genius evident in the way he anticipated and countered enemy movements. Lyra, for her part, discovered abilities that transcended conventional combat. When she shifted to her wolf form, the moon-silver garments transformed with her, becoming a fluid armor that enhanced rather than restricted her movement. The mountain's power flowed through her, allowing her to sense corruption at a distance, to purify areas the Ravagers' forces had tainted, to heal allies with a touch of her muzzle. Most significantly, she could disrupt the control the Ravager exerted over his thralls. Not all could be saved. Many were too far gone, their original selves consumed by the corruption. But some, especially the more recently turned, could be freed. These fought with redoubled fury against their former master, desperate to avenge their violated autonomy. By sunset, the valley floor was littered with the dead and dying. The Ironheart forces had held their position, but at terrible cost. Nearly a third of their warriors had fallen, and many more suffered wounds that would take weeks to heal. The Ravagers' forces had withdrawn, but there was no illusion of victory. This had been merely the first clash in what promised to be a protracted conflict. As darkness fell, Thorn and Lyra moved among the wounded, offering what comfort they could. The Alpha's presence bolstered morale, his quiet words of praise or sympathy carrying more weight than grand speeches. Lyra used her newfound abilities to ease pain and accelerate healing, though each effort drained her further, the power flowing through her exact a physical toll she could not ignore. They made camp beneath the stars. The survivors gathered in tight circles around low fires that did little to dispel the chill of mountain nights. Lyra found Thorn at the perimeter, his powerful frame silhouetted against the moonlit landscape as he surveyed the territory beyond their position. Without words, she joined him, their shoulders touching in silent acknowledgement of shared burden. "This was only the beginning," Thorn finally said, his voice low. "He tests our defenses, measures our strength. The true assault is yet to come." Lyra nodded, the wolf within her restless with the scent of blood and corruption still hanging in the air. "He knows about me now. He felt what I did to his thralls." "Yes," Thorn agreed, something like pride warming his tone despite the gravity of their situation. "You represent a threat he did not anticipate. He will adapt his strategy accordingly." They stood in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow together in their contemplation. The moon rose higher, bathing the valley in silver light that transformed the battlefield into something almost beautiful, nature already beginning to reclaim what violence had disrupted. "When I was marked for the hunt," Lyra finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was a quick death." Thorn turned to her, his golden eyes reflecting moonlight. "And now?" "Now I understand that my life was just beginning," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "That everything before was merely preparation for this moment, this purpose." The Alpha's expression softened, the stern lines of his face relaxing into something more vulnerable, more human. With gentle deliberation, he reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the crescent mark on her cheek. The touch lingered, a question unspoken but clear in the night air between them. Lyra answered by closing the distance, her lips meeting his with certainty that belied their relative positions in the pack hierarchy. The kiss was brief but profound, an acknowledgement of connection that transcended Alpha and Moonbound, leader and follower. When they separated, something fundamental had shifted between them, a balance achieved that neither had thought possible. The journey back to Ironheart Fortress was somber, the train of wounded slowing their progress, the weight of absent comrades hanging heavy in the air. They arrived to find the mountain shrouded in unnatural mist, a manifestation of the Ravagers' growing influence over the territory's spiritual fabric. The corruption was spreading faster than anticipated, the web tightening around their sanctuary. 5 years passed in a blur of continuous warfare. The conflict that had begun with conventional battles evolved into something more complex, a multidimensional struggle fought simultaneously on physical and spiritual fronts. The Ravagers' forces pressed from all sides, probing for weaknesses, seeking entry points to the heart of Ironheart. Each season brought new challenges, new adaptations, new sacrifices. Lyra's powers grew exponentially as she fully embraced her role as Moonbound. No longer the uncertain Omega discovering her strength, she had become a force that even the Elders regarded with respectful awe. Her control over the mountain's energy allowed her to counter the Ravagers' corruption, to heal land and wolves alike, to maintain the seal as it came under increasing pressure from both within and without. Her relationship with Thorn deepened through shared struggle and rare moments of peace. Their bond, forged in crisis and tempered by responsibility, became the cornerstone upon which the pack's resistance rested. They ruled together in practice, if not in formal title, their complementary strengths creating a leadership that inspired unwavering loyalty. The war reached its crisis point on the longest night of the 5th year, when celestial alignments weakened the barriers between worlds. The Ravager, now a towering monstrosity, barely recognizable as the wolf he had once been, led his remaining forces in a desperate assault on Ironheart Fortress itself. His power had grown monstrous through continuous sacrifice and corruption, but so too had his desperation. The entity beneath the mountain called to him more insistently with each passing day, its promises of shared dominion driving him to increasingly reckless action. The battle raged through the night, spreading from the outer defenses to the very halls of the fortress. Ironheart warriors fought with the determination of those defending their home, their families, their way of life. Garrett commanded the central defense, his tactical brilliance evident in how he allocated their diminished forces to greatest effect. Thorn and Lyra fought side by side, moving through the chaos with the coordinated precision of partners who anticipated each other's every move. The Alpha's raw power and combat experience complemented the Moonbound's spiritual abilities and unpredictable tactics. Together, they seemed unstoppable, driving back wave after wave of corrupted thralls. But the Ravager had not committed his full strength to the frontal assault. While the main battle raged, he had slipped away with a small cadre of his most powerful lieutenants, using forgotten passages to penetrate deep into the mountain's heart. His true objective had always been the Chamber of Binding, where the entity's prison could be accessed directly. Lyra sensed the breach first, her connection to the mountain alerting her to the violation of sacred space. Without hesitation, she and Thorn disengaged from the main battle, racing through ancient corridors with desperate speed. They arrived at the Chamber of Binding to find the Ravager already at work, his twisted form hunched before the crystal prison, chanting words in a language that hurt the ear and mind alike. The entity within the crystal column thrashed with renewed vigor, the colors swirling violently as the prison walls began to fracture. Light spilled from the cracks, not illumination but its opposite, a darkness that consumed rather than merely obscured. The chamber trembled, stone groaning under pressures it was never meant to contain. Thorn attacked without hesitation, his golden wolf form launching across the chamber with lethal intent. The Ravager's lieutenants moved to intercept, their corrupted bodies forming a living barrier between their master and the Alpha. Lyra circled wide, seeking a path to the crystal column, understanding instinctively that the ritual must be disrupted before the prison failed completely. What followed was combat at its most primal and desperate. Thorn fought with the accumulated skill of centuries, each movement precise despite the chaos surrounding them. Lyra channeled the mountain's power in focused bursts, disrupting the corrupted energy the Ravager had introduced into the chamber. The lieutenants fell one by one, their twisted forms no match for the combined might of Alpha and Moonbound, fighting to protect what they held most dear. But the Ravager himself proved a more formidable opponent. Corruption had granted him unnatural strength and resistance to conventional attacks. Wounds that would have felled any normal wolf closed almost instantly, the stolen life force of countless sacrifices sustaining him beyond normal limits. He fought with the desperation of one who had committed too fully to his path to consider retreat, driving Thorn back step by step toward the increasingly unstable crystal prison. Lyra recognized the strategy too late. The Ravager was not trying to defeat Thorn outright. He was maneuvering him into position, using the Alpha as an unwitting final component in his breaking ritual. If Thorn's blood, saturated with the mountain's power through generations of connection, were to touch the fracturing crystal at the moment of maximum instability, the resulting resonance would shatter the prison completely. With desperate speed, Lyra intercepted the blow meant to wound, but not kill Thorn. The Ravager's claws tore through her shoulder instead of the Alpha's back, her blood spattering across the chamber floor. Pain exploded through her system, white-hot and all-consuming. But she maintained her position between Thorn and the crystal column. The Ravager howled in frustrated rage, his plan disrupted at the critical moment. But the damage to the prison had progressed too far to be easily contained. Cracks spread across the crystal surface like frost across a window, the darkness within pressing against weakened barriers with increasing force. In that moment of crisis, Lyra made a decision that transcended training or strategy. Drawing on every lesson learned over 5 years of struggle, on every connection forged with the mountain's power, on the bond with Thorn that had become the cornerstone of her existence, she placed her wounded palm directly against the fractured crystal. Pain beyond imagining coursed through her as the mountain's full power used her as a conduit. The wolf within her howled, not in fear, but in triumph, as ancient energies flowed through their shared consciousness. This was what the Moonbound had been created for, not sacrifice, but transformation, the ability to reshape rather than merely maintain. With Lyra as its focus, the mountain's power surged through the chamber, driving back the corruption the Ravager had introduced. The crystal prison reformed, its structure strengthened rather than merely restored, the binding made new rather than merely repaired. The entity within raged against its renewed confinement, but the seals held firm, reinforced by a power it could neither corrupt nor break. The Ravager, sensing his imminent defeat, gathered his remaining strength for a final desperate attack. He lunged not at Thorn but at Lyra, recognizing her as the true threat to his ambitions. His corrupted form moved with unnatural speed, claws extended for a killing blow. Thorn intercepted him mid-leap, the two ancient enemies colliding with forces that shook the chamber's foundations. What followed was combat in its purest form, stripped of strategy or subtlety, two apex predators locked in a struggle that could end only with death. The Ravager fought with the strength of corruption and stolen power. Thorn fought with the accumulated skill of centuries and the desperate need to protect what he valued above his own survival. In the end, it was not strength or skill alone that determined the outcome, but conviction. Where the Ravager fought for power and the satisfaction of ancient grudges, Thorn fought for his pack, his mountain, and the future he had glimpsed but scarcely dared to hope for. With a final, decisive movement, the Alpha drove his claws through his former blood brother's chest, tearing out the corrupted heart that had driven so much suffering. The Ravager's form collapsed, corruption fleeing his body like mist before a strong wind. For a brief moment, as death claimed him, his features returned to something recognizable. The wolf he had been before ambition consumed him. His eyes, clear for the first time in decades, met Thorn's with something like relief before glazing over in death's final release. Throughout the fortress, the thralls the Ravager had controlled collapsed as the will animating them dissolved. The corruption he had spread began to recede, the mountain's natural energy reasserting itself in territories long tainted. The war that had consumed 5 years ended not with dramatic flourish, but with a quiet exhalation, like a body releasing long-held tension. Thorn knelt beside Lyra, gathering her wounded form into his arms with gentle care. The effort of channeling the mountain's full power had exacted a terrible toll. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her breathing shallow, her pulse fluttering weakly beneath his searching fingers. The wound in her shoulder refused to close, corruption lingering in tissues exposed to the Ravager's taint. With desperate determination, the Alpha carried her from the chamber of binding to the healing pools. There, surrounded by the mountain's most concentrated natural power, he submerged her in the restorative waters, his golden eyes never leaving her face, his hand clasping hers as if through will alone he could anchor her to the world of the living. Days passed in anxious vigil, the fortress gradually returning to normal operations around them. Garrett oversaw the final defeat of the remaining corrupted forces. Sierra guided the cleansing of areas tainted by the Ravager's influence. The pack mourned their dead, celebrated their victory, and began the long process of healing wounds both physical and spiritual. On the morning of the 7th day, Lyra opened her eyes. The wound in her shoulder had finally closed, leaving a crescent-shaped scar that mirrored the mark on her cheek. Her body felt simultaneously lighter and more substantial, as if the channeling had burned away something extraneous while strengthening what remained. The wolf within her was no longer a separate presence, but fully integrated, two halves of a whole, finally and completely unified. Thorn's relief manifested as a tangible change in the atmosphere, tension releasing so suddenly that even the stone walls seemed to exhale. He helped her from the pool, supporting her still weak form with a tenderness few in the pack would have believed their stern Alpha capable of. Words were unnecessary between them now, their bond transcending conventional communication. Recovery took time. The war had left scars on land and wolves alike that would not quickly heal. But with the Ravager's threat eliminated and the entity securely bound, the mountain's power flowed freely once more, accelerating renewal on all fronts. Under Thorn and Lyra's joint leadership, the Ironheart Pack entered a period of reconstruction and expansion, reclaiming territories lost during the conflict and establishing new connections with neighboring packs. The most profound changes occurred not in the physical landscape, but in the pack's social structure. The rigid hierarchy that had relegated wolves like Lyra to Omega status gave way to a more fluid system based on contribution rather than accident of birth. The hunt of the blood moon, that ancient culling ritual, was transformed into a test of courage and skill that ended not in death but in celebration of potential realized. 5 years after the Ravagers' defeat, Ironheart Fortress had been transformed. No longer merely a defensive stronghold, it had become the center of a thriving community that extended throughout the mountain range. The Great Hall, once austere and intimidating, now rang with laughter and conversation as pack members of all ranks gathered freely. The walls, previously bare stone, were adorned with tapestries commemorating not just battles won, but lessons learned, connections forged, futures envisioned. On a clear autumn morning, Thorn stood on the highest tower, surveying the territory that had flourished under his leadership. Silver threaded his once pure black hair, and new lines marked his face, not merely from age, but from the novel experience of smiling. His posture remained powerful, his presence commanding, but the weight that had once seemed a permanent part of his bearing had lifted. Lyra joined him, moving with the fluid grace that had become her hallmark. Motherhood had softened her features without diminishing her strength, adding new dimensions to the woman who had once been the pack's lowest member. The crescent marks on her palm and cheek glowed faintly in the morning light, badges of a position that was now understood and honored rather than feared. From the training yard below came the sounds of children at play, their excited voices carrying on the crisp air. Among them, 2 figures stood out. Eric, their son, a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's golden eyes and quiet intensity. And Arya, their daughter, barely 2 years old, but already displaying the unprecedented ability to shift forms at will, her tiny wolf shape romping among the larger cubs with fearless enthusiasm. "The elders are in quite a state over Arya," Lyra observed, amusement warming her voice. "They've searched the oldest records and found nothing like her. A shifter from birth with control that most adults would envy." Thorn's deep chuckle rumbled through the air between them. "The elders will adapt, as they have to all the changes of these past years. The old ways had value, but they could not have prepared us for this new world we're building." His arms circled her waist, drawing her against his side with comfortable familiarity. Below them, Arya shifted back to human form to hug her brother, her laughter floating up to them like music. Eric's serious expression melted into a smile as he returned the embrace, his natural protectiveness already evident in how he positioned himself between his sister and the more rambunctious cubs. "She carries the mountain's blessing more directly than any wolf in our history," Lyra said, maternal pride mingling with spiritual certainty. "Not merely moonbound as I am, but something new, something more integrated, the next evolution of what we can become." Thorn nodded, his expression thoughtful. The first alpha sacrificed himself because he could see no other way to contain the entity. For 1,000 years we maintained his pattern, never questioning if there might be a better approach. It took an outsider, someone the pack had discarded, to show us a different path. His golden eyes turned to her, warm with an emotion that needed no name between them. "You were never the key to simply maintaining the old prison, Lyra. You were the key to transforming it, to changing the relationship between our kind and the mountain's power." The morning sun crested the eastern ridge, bathing the fortress in golden light. Below them, pack life continued its daily rhythms. Warriors trained, craftsmen worked, hunters prepared for the day's expedition. But intermixed with these traditional activities were new ones: scholars studying ancient texts with fresh perspective, healers combining conventional methods with the spiritual techniques Lyra had pioneered, young wolves of all ranks training together, their potential limited only by dedication rather than birth. "There will be other challenges," Thorn acknowledged, ever the pragmatist. "Other threats, other changes we cannot anticipate." Lyra leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder with comfortable familiarity. "And we will meet them, as we have everything else, together." Below, Eric had shifted to his wolf form, a gleaming gold cub already showing signs of his father's impressive size. Arya clambered onto his back, her tiny hands fisting in his fur as he carried her in careful circles around the training yard. Around them, other cubs watched with admiration and a touch of envy, witness to the new possibilities their alpha's children represented. Together, Thorn agreed, the word both acknowledgement of their past and promise for their future. The mountain endures, and so do we. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and stone, of autumn leaves and wood smoke, of a territory healthy and thriving. The mountain beneath their feet hummed with renewed energy, the connection between land and wolves stronger than it had been in centuries. And at the center of it all stood Thorn and Lyra, Alpha and Moonbound, no longer merely rulers, but architects of a future limited only by imagination and will. The entity remained bound beneath them, but the nature of its containment had fundamentally changed. No longer merely imprisoned, it had become part of the mountain's ecology, its power channeled and transformed rather than simply restrained. The threat remained, as all great powers carry potential for both creation and destruction. But now it existed in balance, contained not by sacrifice, but by understanding. As the sun rose higher, Lyra and Thorn descended from their vantage point to join their children, their pack, their future. The fortress that had once been merely a stronghold had become a home. The pack that had once been merely a hierarchy had become a community, and the two wolves who had once been merely Alpha and Omega had become something unprecedented, a partnership that had reshaped not just their own lives, but the destiny of their entire kind. The mountain remembered, the moon remembered, and the story of the wolf that should not have been but was, the moonbound who had transformed rather than merely preserved, would echo through generations yet unborn, a testament to the power of evolution over tradition, of renewal over stagnation, of love over fear.